The privatization of railways in the UK is well known and often talked about in transit circles. But, as usual, people too often forget about the buses. Indeed, for many of the same reasons as on the rail side, bus deregulation in the UK has created tons of problems over the decades. So much so that when people here in North America say, "The transit is so good in Europe," I have to say, yeah, but not the local transit in the UK, at least outside of London. Fortunately, the times are changing, and big positive change is coming to the bus industry in the UK. So let's talk about the problems of bus deregulation and how this major change is going to change local public transport for the better up and down the country. Welcome to RM Transit, a channel about public transportation policy. The history of the bus industry in the UK is complicated, and this video isn't meant to be a comprehensive history of bus deregulation or anything like that. I want to talk about the impacts of deregulation and what comes next. Much like rail transport, bus transport in the UK is a weird hodgepodge of public and private. And while there are some people who still try to attempt to argue that the way the UK rail industry has been structured for the last several decades isn't terrible, I really don't see that being argued for the buses. That's probably in part because the standard for rail transport in the UK just feels like it's higher. The UK doesn't have the best rail system in the world, but it's far from the worst, and it's okay. But the buses are not okay. Outside of London, they provide far worse service than they should. Indeed, bus deregulation in the UK has been and is a big deal, with control of local public transit networks taken out of the hands of local government across the country outside of London. Which of course creates a pretty nice natural experiment. How do the buses do in London versus in the rest of the country where deregulation happened? Well, of course, the buses in London have done far better. In much of the rest of the country, bus ridership is down and driving is up. Of course, this is bad, which is why HS2 was cancelled so that more roads could be built for drivers. Unfortunately, since these days the services and bones of so many of the local bus networks across the country are kind of weak because of years of underinvestment and because of deregulation, creating a reversal of that policy is going to be a real challenge. Deregulation has meant a lot of things. Subsidies dropped precipitously, and so fares have gone up and services often gotten worse. While initially there was a fair amount of competition, and to some degree that still does happen, and actually historically there are some crazy examples of city streets being flooded by buses from different companies, which is not great, but yay, lots of buses. It seems to have become obvious pretty quickly why this was a bad idea. Imagine for a second the air travel market. You have busier routes and less busy routes, and typically there's more competition and service options on the busier routes since they tend to be more profitable. That competition means lower fares, busier routes, and a virtuous cycle of passenger concentration on particular corridors, often to the detriment of less profitable connectivity routes that connect to smaller communities. Now, imagine that same model of aiming for the most profitable routes, but within a city where people are trying to take the local bus to get to work, school, or just for groceries. It has been a disaster. Turning buses into a laissez-faire free-for-all has meant a fair amount of service on the busiest routes. That is, as long as competition between multiple operators lasts, and so you get extra service. But at the same time, you get what is a quasi-abandonment of less busy services, but also service during less busy times, like weekends, evenings, and midday periods. And that's actually very strange, because weekend ridership has been growing in a ton of cities around the world in recent years. But with the deregulated model, where bus service is reactive to demand, as opposed to trying to stimulate it by providing a good service, you don't get that opportunity to build new ridership markets. The simple reality is that the system optimizes for bus operator profit, not good service, or emissions reductions, or even just public transport ridership. Clearly, the reason for public transport to exist is to provide some benefit to society, not to make it so that there can be a few small profitable bus businesses. And that kind of highlights the center of the problem. It's also meant worse pay and labor standards for drivers, which is obviously not a good thing. Public transport is a critical service that keeps society moving and the economy functioning. If the drivers aren't secure in their jobs and well paid, then this critical service could collapse quite easily, as seems to happen periodically in the UK. And it's not just some superfluous statistics that this approach to bus operation has affected. It's led to worse transit networks, since operators are trying to maximize revenue, not maximize connectivity. And those two things aren't the same. There's also less ability to cross-subsidize lower-use routes to try to build ridership up by providing lower fares and better service. That leads to this really fickle network where you have decent service on busy corridors but very poor connecting service, where the value of connectivity in the network is really undervalued. And since cities are so often served by multiple competing companies, there's a huge potential for a fractured passenger experience, from fares to wayfinding and timetabling. And since most of the control for route and timetable design lies with private bus operators as opposed to, say, the local government, there's a real incentive to cut back subsidies. Why subsidize a service that you have so little control over? And that lack of subsidy as well as local engagement just leads into a transit death spiral, which is terrible. So clearly the experiment has failed disastrously. Bus ridership outside of London is way down, and competition hasn't really happened the way that was expected. The industry has become super concentrated among a small number of large bus operators. What's worse, and this is kind of strange, is that the competition that does happen is actually really wasteful. You'll have an upstart try to challenge an incumbent bus operating company, and they'll spend a ton of money trying to unseat them. And if they do, well, they're now the incumbent, and if they don't, well, they spent a ton of money not becoming the incumbent. In either case, it leads to inconsistent service for passengers and no real net benefit in service, but tons of money spent. It's wasteful. At the same time, the desire to make money as opposed to providing a good public transport network that benefits all of society often means kind of bad vehicles and poor networks. And despite the fact that this is a market-based approach, it's clearly worse for the economy. More money has to be shoveled into inefficient infrastructure, that is roads and parking lots. People can't as easily get out, spend money, and earn money. And there's a lot of waste happening, as I mentioned before. Fortunately though, this might actually all change. To put it simply, as I noted in my Manchester Explained video, some local bus services in the UK are being brought back under local control. And Manchester will actually be following London's model with this. Essentially how this works is the city or other regional authorities can plan out a comprehensive bus network with reasonable, coherent route service levels, as well as nice, consistent buses, consistent and fair fares, and good inter-route connectivity. And once this has been designed, then private operators can bid to operate the actual services, but meeting the standards set by local government. Instead of operators making their money from the fares directly, they'll be paid by local government, who can then move the fares around to cross-subsidize different routes and invest in more service. This change is going to transform local transport in the UK for the better. But things aren't even quite what they could eventually be. In a lot of cities around the world, like Toronto for example, there is actually a city-owned bus company. The city owns the buses, employs the drivers, and runs the service. And ultimately, this is probably how something like local public transport should work. People need the bus to get to work and for the city to function. And having that critical infrastructure be privately owned and operated and subject to the whims of the market probably isn't a good thing. It's actually also not possible to get to the same low cost of operation with a private operating scenario as opposed to a public one, because the public sector doesn't need to make a profit. Ultimately though, while city-owned bus companies are a great next step, the truth is this is a great change for the UK. Local transport should be under local control. Thanks for watching.